Right now, Russia and Ukraine are at war. The headlines focus on the fighting, the sanctions, the politics. But there's one thing that's received less attention, and that's the cultural shift that's happening behind the scenes. In Ukraine, there's a concerted effort to remove Russian and Soviet influence, what's often called de-Russification and decommunization. Streets have been renamed, monuments have come down, and even the likes of Pushkin are now being questioned. But in Moscow, things look very different. Despite the war, signs of Ukraine are visible absolutely everywhere here, not just in museums, but in the literal fabric of the city. Street names, statues, metro stations, bridges, and that's what I want to show you today. This is a walk through Ukrainian Moscow. Let's start with one of the most iconic buildings in the city, Hotel Ukraine. This was one of Stalin's 7 sisters, the towering wedding cake style skyscrapers built after World War II to demonstrate Soviet power and modernity. And the design is unmistakably grand. It's inspired by American skyscrapers of the 1930s, but with a distinctly Soviet twist. It's got spires, stars, columns, and heroic statues. And when this building was opened in 1957, it was named Hotel Ukraine, part of a Soviet tradition which named grand buildings and boulevards after the republics of the USSR to reflect unity and diversity. Each Soviet republic was meant to be proud, like an equal sibling in one big family. But of course that wasn't the case. They weren't really equal. Actually, in some ways, of course, the Soviet Union was a real union of countries, and in other ways it was an imperial project. But nevertheless, symbolism mattered. Ukraine was second only to Russia in population and power within the USSR. Ukraine was a vital and incredibly important part of the Soviet Union, and without Ukraine, the Soviet Union really could not exist. So naming this towering hotel after Ukraine was more than just a label. It was a statement of the Republic's prestige and importance within the Soviet project. And right outside the hotel, there's an even more striking symbol. This is Taras Shevchenko. If you're foreign, you might not know who he is, but if you grew up in Ukraine, you definitely studied him in school. For Ukrainians, he's a poet, but he's not just a poet. He's the national poet. He's the founding figure of modern Ukrainian literature. He is the symbol of the Ukrainian language, of Ukrainian culture, and Ukrainian resistance. He is the William Shakespeare of Ukraine. Shevchenko was born in 1814 in a small village in the Cherkasy region, which at that time was part of the Russian Empire. Actually, it had just recently become part of the Russian Empire after previously being part of Poland after the Polish partition. Shevchenko started his life as a serf. He was literally owned by a noble family as a slave. But eventually he had his freedom bought for him. He didn't pay for himself. A Russian, not a Ukrainian, a Russian artist saw the talent and the potential in Shevchenko and paid for him to be released from slavery. And as a free man, he studied in St. Petersburg at the Imperial Academy of Arts and became a very successful painter as well as writer. He actually wrote a lot in Russian, but his poetry, which he's most famous for, was written in Ukrainian. And that poetry was deeply political. It, of course, attacked serfdom, as well as autocracy and Russification. He was very clearly a very patriotic Ukrainian. And in 1847, he was actually arrested by the Tsarist authorities and exiled for years. He was banned as well from writing and from painting, and his brutal treatment at the hands of the authorities undoubtedly contributed to his death, but of course his legend today. You see, Shevchenko has a very complicated legacy because he, like many people in Russia at the time, was opposed to serfdom and opposed to the Tsar and the authoritarianism and wanted a more equal society. And this was also deeply connected to his views on the unequal relationship between Moscow and Ukraine. He actually wanted a lot more recognition of Ukraine as a country. Interestingly, however, he also had some pan-Slavist views, and he also continued to maintain contacts with lots of Russians, especially Russian intelligentsia. But if you ask Russians today about Shevchenko, they will say that Shevchenko wasn't anti-Russian. He didn't renounce Russia as a country, but rather was against its authoritarian and conservative Tsarist leadership. And of course, he wasn't the only one at the time. Lots of Russian people were against it, and that's a given when you think about the upcoming Russian Revolution, which was just a few decades later. And after all, before the Russian Tsars, there was no serfdom in Ukraine, which was obviously a big reason why Shevchenko targeted the likes of Peter the Great, who once decreed that Ukrainian books and records were to be burned, and more prominently he also targeted Catherine the Great, who Shevchenko famously named or accused of being the person who finally killed or finished off Ukraine. If you go to Ukraine, however, and you ask modern day Ukrainians, Shevchenko was actually not just anti-government, but he was totally and vehemently anti-Russian. And his criticism was not simply about the Tsar and the system, but Russia as a whole. So the fact that his statue is here in central Moscow, right in front of a building named after Ukraine, across the river from Russia's White House, right behind this tree here, is certainly worthy of note, because today he's considered one of the cornerstones of Ukrainian identity. And the idea that he's still standing here in a city which Ukrainians see as its enemy speaks massive volumes about the complicated and tangled history between the two countries, Russia and Ukraine. If you walk just across the road from Hotel Ukraine, you'll find this is Ukraine Boulevard. It's a leafy promenade, it's a peaceful stretch of path popular with dog walkers and cyclists, and on most days it's quiet, but when the weather is good, like today, it's a lovely place to go for a walk. But tucked into the corner of the boulevard, a little bit further down, is another statue that tells a big story. Let's go. So this person you're seeing on screen now is Lesya Ukrainka, another literary giant from Ukraine. She was born in 1871 in the Volyn region in what is now northwest Ukraine and was then the Russian Empire. Her real name was Larissa Kosach, but she wrote under a pen name that literally means Ukrainian woman, Ukrainka. So, like Shevchenko, she actually wrote in Ukrainian at a time when the language was marginalized and actually sometimes outright banned in public life. Because the Russian Empire had at that time long considered Ukrainian to be a peasant dialect, not a real language, and it had issued multiple decrees suppressing its use in education and in publishing. And at that time, in Western Ukraine in particular, many people spoke Ukrainian as their native language. In the East, especially in the cities, the urbanized areas, people mainly spoke Russian. But in the rural areas of Ukraine, including in the East, especially in the Northeast, in areas like Sumy, people spoke a language known as Sojik, which is basically a pidgin mix of Russian and Ukrainian. People still speak it today. Ukrainka, though, herself was from Volyn, like I said, which was a mainly Ukrainian-speaking area. And despite laws cracking down on Ukrainian usage, she defied it. She was highly educated, she was multilingual, she was fluent in German, French, Italian, Greek, but she chose to write in Ukrainian. Her plays and poems dealt with topics like feminism, nationalism, personal freedom, and she wrote some of her most powerful, most famous work when she was battling tuberculosis, which ultimately killed her at the early age of just 42. And this statue was unveiled in 2006 in cooperation with the Ukrainian embassy, and it was meant as a gesture of cultural friendship. Of course, back then Russia and Ukraine were not yet at war. So the statue was built, it was put up, and the plaque was written, and even today that name remains on the statue, Lesya Ukrainka. It hasn't been removed, nobody has defaced it. In fact, people actually put flowers at the base a few years ago. It's still here. A short walk from Ukrainian Boulevard is this Kiev train station, one of Moscow's 9 main railway stations, and in my opinion, one of the most beautiful. From here, trains used to run directly to Ukraine, to cities like Kiev, Odessa, and Lviv. The building itself dates to the early 20th century, and construction began under the final Tsar of the Russian Empire, Nicholas II, and it was originally called Bryansky Station, after the city of Bryansk. It was renamed in 1934 to Kievsky at the height of the Stalin era, and of course that renaming was political. It tied Moscow to Kiev, and it symbolized unity within the Soviet Union. The station is topped with a tall clock tower, which deliberately echoes the Italian Renaissance, a reminder of the Russian Empire's desire at that time to align itself with European grandeur. Inside, the departure boards still show trains heading west, although many of the direct lines to Ukraine were cut after 2014 and Crimea, and the rest, of course, after 2022. Today, the station is still called Kiev Station, though some far-right Liberal Democrat politicians have called for it to be renamed again to Bryansky Station, although I personally think that is highly unlikely. Even more symbolic than the train station are the metro stations. Underneath the train station there are 3 lines that meet here at the Kievskaya metro station, and all of them were built as architectural homages to Ukraine. This one on the Circle Line was opened in 1954. It was actually the very last station that Stalin personally approved. It was designed as part of the Soviet effort to showcase friendship between the peoples, friendship between Russians and Ukrainians. And the walls in the metro station are lined with massive mosaics showing happy Ukrainian villagers dancing, building, harvesting wheat, and of course shaking hands with Russians. And it's kitsch, obviously, but it's also very powerful in its message. The message is, unlike other parts of the USSR, Ukraine was presented not just as another brotherly republic, but as essential to the Soviet story. And again, it's all still here in 2025. None of these mosaics have been covered up or anything like that. The name hasn't been changed, Kievsky, it's still the same. One of the other lines actually at the station is the dark blue line, which is decorated with a series of frescoes by artists depicting life in Ukraine. And there, most famously, is a large mosaic at the end of the platform, which commemorates the 300th anniversary of the reunification of Russia and Ukraine, which of course today is a very controversial topic in both Moscow and Kiev. This bridge here might not look historical at first glance, and of course it isn't, but the name definitely is. It's the Bogdan Khmelnitsky Bridge. It's a glass-covered pedestrian walkway that links this side of the river, which is the Kievsky area, to the other side. It was completed in 2001, but of course its name is much older. Its name honours Bogdan Khmelnitsky, the 17th century Cossack leader who led a major uprising against Polish rule in what is now Ukraine. After years of war against the Polish, he signed the 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav, which brought his Cossack hetmanate into alliance with Tsarist Russia. And that's actually the 300th anniversary of the reunification of Russia and Ukraine that I just mentioned in the metro station. And whether that agreement was a military alliance or vassalage or a strategic surrender is very debated today. But it became a foundational myth for Russian-Ukrainian unity. In the Soviet period, Khmelnitsky was portrayed as a unifier, a hero who brought Ukraine back into the Russian fold. There are towns and stations and monuments all across Russia named after him. However, in Ukraine, his legacy is a lot more complex. Some see him as a freedom fighter. Others see him as someone who doomed Ukrainian independence by handing it over to Moscow. But here in Moscow itself, the name, of course, sticks. This is the Khmelnitsky Bridge, right next to, on my right over here, Kievsky Station. Interesting way history is again folded in on itself in modern Russia. This is Poltavskaya Street, named after the Ukrainian city of Poltava, where the Russian Empire under Peter the Great famously defeated, won a huge battle against Sweden and Charles XII. So it makes sense why Moscow would have a street named after such an important battle in Russian history. It's perhaps the one battle that turned Russia from a regional power into a superpower. But in the southwest of the city, mostly in residential districts, there are more traces of Ukraine. There are actually many streets named after Ukrainian cities. For example, Odeskaya Street, named after Odessa, the Black Sea port city that was once part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and now independent Ukraine. It was historically a very Russian-speaking city, but also a cosmopolitan city, home to Jewish, Russian, Ukrainian, Greek, and many more. It was actually a city where Pushkin lived, and where, Russian writers drank wine on the seafront and where Soviet naval power was once based. Nearby to Odessa Street, there are a number of streets named after other cities, including the Dnipropetrovskaya Street, named after the city Ukrainians today call Dnipro, Kharkovskaya Street, named after the city Ukrainians today call Kharkiv, very near the Russian border, and Kryvoroshka ulica, Kryvoroshka Street, which is named after the hometown of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Nowhere is the complexity of Russian-Ukrainian identity more visible than the story of Nikolai Gogol. I'm currently sat on Gogol Boulevard here in the center of Moscow, and next to me, right there on my right, is one of the two major statues of Gogol in Moscow. This one was unveiled in 1952 during Stalin's final years, and it's an idealized, heroic statue made to look like a calm, contemplative genius. But just a few blocks away sits the older statue, which was cast in 1909. And this statue is very different. Gogol is hunched, he's anxious, he's like wrapped in a heavy cloak. He almost looks tormented. And Stalin hated that statue famously. He thought it looked weak and depressive, so they moved it off the main boulevard. They placed it in a courtyard, actually next to the house where Gogol once lived, and they replaced it on the boulevard with a more triumphant version, this version you've already seen. And the split between these two statues is an interesting mirror of the bigger split over Gogol's identity, because he was born in 1809 in a small village next to Poltava, in what was then the Russian Empire and what today is central Ukraine. His father was a playwright who wrote in both Russian and Ukrainian, and the household culture of the Gogol family was unmistakably Ukrainian. Folk stories, Cossack legends, village humour, all these things shaped Gogol's early works. If you read stories like Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, that's what it's called, and that story is soaked in Ukrainian folklore. But he also wrote in Russian, and he actually moved to St. Petersburg to make his career. And that career, of course, famously exploded with the government inspector and Dead Souls, which are biting, surreal, satirical works that really laid the foundation for Russian literary realism, and of course they were set in St. Petersburg. And yet, despite his success, Gogol was actually mocked when he was alive in elite circles for his provincialism. There are stories about him speaking Russian in a thick Ukrainian accent, and at that time his colleagues viewed him as an exotic outsider. Talented, of course, but he was never quite one of them. And in Ukraine today, many people see Gogol as a stolen figure, someone who was very Ukrainian but had to write in Russian because Ukrainian literature was suppressed. Here in Russia, he's taught, of course, as one of the greats. He's really part of the national canon. And the truth, of course, is both. His identity, like his work, refuses to fit neatly into either of these boxes, and that's what makes his legacy so difficult today. Gogol is just one of many that fit this category. Take Ivan Ivazovsky, born in 1817 in Crimea, then part of the Russian Empire. He was ethnically Armenian, and he painted the sea like nobody else. Moody, luminous, endless Black Sea canvases. He's my favourite painter. And there's actually a ulica Ivazovskaya, an Ivazovsky Street here in Moscow. Russia claims him, Ukraine claims him, Armenia claims him, and they're all right in like different ways. Someone else is Sergei Prokofiev, the composer behind Romeo and Juliet, War and Peace, many other things. He was born in a village called Santsivka, which is now in Donetsk, the Donetsk region. And he left the Soviet Union after the revolution. He lived in Paris and America, but returned under Stalin. And some of his most powerful work, famous work, was written under censorship and pressure and fear. Russia highlights him as a genius, and of course he was. And Ukraine points to his birthplace as meaning that he's a Ukrainian great rather than a Russian great. You be the judge. Let's talk also about Vasily Grossman, who was born in Berdichev, which is Ukraine. He wrote Life and Fate, one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, and it was banned in the USSR for decades. And he was Jewish, Soviet, Ukrainian born, and he wrote in Russian. Good luck labeling that. I want to talk about as well Anna Akhmatova, a titan of Russian poetry. Her family roots trace back to Ukraine. The Akhmatov noble line is obviously in the south, and her poetry often drew on the landscape of the Black Sea and the Ukrainian steppe. Her son was, of course, famously imprisoned by the Soviet authorities, and her words were censored. They were copied by hand and passed around like pirated contraband. And her legacy belongs to more than one place. I'll talk about one more. I'll talk about Ilya Repin, perhaps the most famous painter in Russian history. He painted the Volga barge haulers. He painted Ivan the Terrible and his son. He did portraits of Leo Tolstoy, but he was born near Kharkiv, but trained in St. Petersburg and retired to a dacha in Finland. His roots are Ukrainian, his career is Russian, and his politics were complicated. And of course, here actually in the Moscow region, not in Moscow itself, there's a Repin Street. This is a list that can go on for hours and hours and hours, and these aren't marginal figures. They're central to what's often called Russian culture, but their biographies are messy. Their identities straddle borders that didn't exist when they were alive. And now today people argue if they're Russian or Ukrainian, and the answer is it's not clean, which is, of course, not acceptable for so many people. So what does all of this mean? It means that history doesn't fit clearly into wartime narratives of 2025. History doesn't obey new borders or political demands. The story of Ukraine and Russia it's just too entangled. It's too layered. It's too old for simple narratives like that. And you know, there's names that are being removed in Kiev, like Pushkin or Lermontov, that are still enshrined here. And there are names being fought over in Ukraine, like Shevchenko or Ukrainka, or I don't know, there's a huge list of names, but are still standing here in Moscow. There's no plaque to explain that. There's no sort of news headline, and there's no sign that says, look at this contradiction, but it's everywhere, and it's impossible to avoid, because Moscow is really a city where you can walk past a statue of a Ukrainian national poet outside a hotel named after a country which is now at war with the one you're standing in, and nobody blinks, nobody thinks it's strange. And I'm not making a judgment here. I'm actually not even trying to interpret it. I don't think it's my place to interpret it. I'm just pointing it out. Because sometimes I think history doesn't actually need a conclusion. It just needs to be noticed. And I don't really know where I'm going to go with this, but thanks for watching.